It's Friday, February 6th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. This week has been such a wild week when it comes to elections. I know that we are almost a year out, a little under a year out, let's say 9 months out from the 2026 midterms in November. But states and counties and the places you live are already getting ready for those things. The people who run our elections are already getting ready for those. And this week, so is the federal government. We have seen the president call for, quote unquote, nationalizing or federalizing elections in 15 places, something I'll get to in my conversation today. We are seeing lawsuits from the Department of Justice, Office of Civil Rights, in 24 states, asking for things like your social security numbers, things that they don't really need to do what they want to do, but they just want to have them. It's something I wrote about yesterday in the Make It Make Sense Substack. It was an exclusive about the Assistant Attorney General, Hamid Dillon, who is working against what she said just 3 years ago. And then we are still dealing with the fallout of the federal government seizing ballot boxes and tabulating machines from Fulton County in Georgia and from Puerto Rico. It's why my guest today is Michael McNulty. He's the policy director at Issue One. They are a bipartisan, election-focused nonprofit organization that works to help people understand elections and to help make our elections safer and more secure. We talk all about the ways that the federal government right now is trying to interfere in the way that states run elections, even though that's directly against what the Constitution says. And we also talk about a brand new report from Issue One that's frankly pretty troubling, that says half of the people who ran elections between 2020 and 2024 in the western states of the United States have left their jobs, most of them for personal reasons, and most of those reasons are because people are being threatened over just doing the basic thing of making sure Americans are able to vote. It is a conversation that we should all be having right now, we should all be thinking about, because democracy takes all of us. You'll hear Michael say that at the end of this interview. And voting is the way that most of us participate. But right now, we might all need to pitch in just a little bit more. Before we get to that conversation, make sure you're following or subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack so you can get access to that article. That exclusive is up for free right now, by the way. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter and Blue Sky, and at Grant_Herms on everything else. All right, let's get to my conversation with Michael McNulty. Does coffee make you anxious, sweaty, unfocused, or maybe your doctor thinks you have a crippling caffeine addiction, which I am definitely not in any way referencing for my personal life? Let me turn you on to Mantra Matcha. Mantra Matcha is ceremonial-grade matcha from a private hillside in Uji, Japan. Smooth, naturally sweet, and it gives you this calm, focused energy without the jitters. It's packed with antioxidants like more than 130 times more than regular green tea, so you feel energized and you feel good. Now, the matcha flavor isn't for everybody, but good news, Mantra has 6 infused flavors like banana cacao, strawberry lemon, cinnamon goji berry, and rosehip dragon fruit, which sounds like a name from Game of Thrones, but it's delicious. Plus, every box you buy helps provide a meal to a child through the No Kid Hungry program, which we love. Now, right now, listeners to Make It Make Sense can go to mantramatcha.com and use the code MIMS25 for 15% off. Now, that code also supports Make It Make Sense with a commission. That's how these things work. I got to legally tell you. But the good news is you'll help the show, you'll stay caffeinated, and maybe not too much. Again, that code at mantramatcha.com is MIMS25 for 15% off. Mantra Matcha, less chaos, more clarity, 2 things we could all use a little bit of right now. All right, let's get on with the show. Michael, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Grant.
Let's start here with the big look at the dangers to our electoral system. We had the president in the past week say he wanted to nationalize elections somehow. You've got folks like Steve Bannon saying that they want to see ICE agents at polling places. How under threat are our elections right now?
It's a great question. I think we really need to be paying close attention right now, and we need to be connecting the dots. what is being said, whether it's rhetoric about from the president about nationalizing the voting, or from Steve Bannon about ICE agents at polls, or whether it's actual actions like the FBI raid in Fulton County this past week, which they seized 700 ballot boxes. To the Department of Justice has been demanding getting private voter list data from almost all the states over the last several months, and has filed lawsuits against states to get that. These are just a few of the dots that we need to be connecting within the broader theme of an executive branch that is bent on trying to control and interfere in our election process. I actually worked internationally for several decades before I joined Issue One, and I've seen how this sort of authoritarian behavior, this sort of attempt to centralize and interfere in elections happens from the leadership of countries. And I can tell you what we're seeing now is following the hallmarks of that behavior, which is why I think we all should be very concerned about what is happening. The good news is that the United States, we have a decentralized system of elections. The Constitution is very, very clear. The founders designed it very smartly in that sense. Elections are run by states. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution says states run the elections. The executive branch literally has no role in determining how elections are run. Congress can determine some legislation related to federal elections, but ultimately the power is in the states to determine and control how elections are run. So there are very clear, at least constitutional protections against some of the worst forms of what we could see in executive interference. That being said, there is a wide spectrum of types of manipulation and interference that the executive branch could do, that the administration could do, and we can talk more in detail about that. But I do want to emphasize that there are a lot of strong protections in the United States against that, and we all need to be paying close attention and speaking up and pushing Congress and pushing our state legislators and those who can protect against the executive interference to simply protect the Constitution.
Right.
It's simply protecting what's in the Constitution.
Right. Just do what Article 1, Section 4 says. I just wrote a piece yesterday as we're talking about the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, the DOJ, who 3 years ago, said the exact thing that she said, that the Constitution says that states administer elections, and is now in charge of the division of the DOJ that is actively working to undermine that. And I also read a civics newsletter called Things You Forgot from Civics Class. And I've talked a lot about this idea too of how elections are decentralized and how these things actually work. So listeners will be at least somewhat familiar with these ideas. But let's talk a little bit about the other sort of vulnerabilities here. One of them, I think we saw in Fulton County, is the idea that federal authorities in some way, shape, or form could, on election night, seize ballots before they're counted. Is that possible? Because there is a logistical issue with the idea of federalizing elections, in that we just don't have enough people to be boots on the ground. Like, it would just be nearly impossible to marshal that kind of anti-election army or whatever. But what are the things that are at risk here?
Great question. So I'll start with a couple of responses to what you just said, and then I think we should zoom out and look at the spectrum of the types of executive interference that could happen. So specifically on troops coming in and seizing ballots, there is a very clear laws against that. Is completely illegal for any armed federal troops to be present in or around voting centers, polling places, et cetera. Very clear, very illegal, should not be able to happen. That being said, we have seen the behavior that the administration has undertaken with breaking the rules and then letting the courts decide after the fact, and then maybe following the courts or not. So I think we have to be very vigilant about, even if something is against the law, that doesn't mean that the administration won't attempt to do it anyway and then deal with the consequences later. Because, as you said, on election day, it's a finite period of time.
Right.
So I think we do need to be vigilant. And I know there are a lot of election administrators and officials, great, brave heroes of democracy across the country, that are preparing for that exact scenario. I think the ICE situation, the ICE agent situation, is slightly different because those are not federal armed troops per se, as it might be spelled out in the law. That being said, there are very clear laws against voter intimidation, voter pressure. There are very strong protections against that. So again, any attempt to mobilize ICE agents in or around polling stations, even if technically it's related to an ongoing operation, could very, very clearly be challenged in court and declared illegal. So again, it's something that people are preparing for, because we need to take what the administration says at its word. If President Trump says we're going to nationalize elections, we have to take him at his word that he's going to try. And so that's crucial to keep in mind. But again, we do have very strong legal protections against that. I think the only thing that's out there that could allow for troops to intervene in elections is the Insurrection Act, which would require, a response to an armed hostile force, right? Which is not going to be the case, obviously. But just to zoom out a little bit on the broader, I wanted to answer your earlier question about it's not possible to deploy so many troops across the country that you could, undermine elections, which is another strength of our system, that we have thousands of different individual little elections that are run by local officials, and you can't manipulate all of that at once. Agreed. However, with the House race and with the Senate races, we know that, only a handful of these races are actually toss-ups and or lean one way or the other. So we'd still have to be very careful that it only takes maybe, 10 to 12 to 15 districts in the country to be targeted with interference and to maybe have a dramatic impact on who takes the House or takes the Senate in some cases.
Right. I mean, the president did say, when he said nationalizing elections to Dan Bongino, he said in like 15 places. So it's not that he just said it, but there's also, at least it seems, there's some sort of framework or idea of what those places would be. Now, he could just be talking about some swing states and maybe some Senate seats he's aware of, but it also could be more than that. And so I think that's a really important point to keep in clear view.
I think you're absolutely right. And we need, again, connecting the dots, right? He didn't say 15 out of coincidence, right? That could be 15 states. That could be counties that were where they have spread, where he and his allies have spread false narratives in the past, where there were very close contested elections. Fulton County is already number one, right? You have places like Maricopa County, Wayne County, Philadelphia County, Milwaukee, Clark County, DeKalb County. So we can see and list the places where they're high risk for another FBI raid or another interference, or, hopefully not, but some sort of attempt to deploy some sort of national presence around the polling stations.
Right.
And then again, to zoom out a little bit more, when we think about, what the Trump administration and the executive branch could try to do to sort of interfere in elections, overstep the constitutional protections that states run elections, deploying troops and other things is not really the only means to do that, right? There are a whole spectrum of things, and actually probably higher risk things, because either they're already happening or they're more likely to happen. One, you can kind of create a fear and paralysis among election officials and other people trying to implement these elections, with constant investigations, with constant threats of lawsuits. These can obviously tie people up in legal cases. We are seeing that already, with 24 lawsuits being brought against the heads of elections, secretaries of state in 24 states, where all they're trying to do is protect their voters' own private data. And the Department of Justice is demanding access to unredacted private voter data from those states. And when the secretaries of state say, sorry, it's against our privacy laws, we can't give you this data, what they get in response is a lawsuit. Right. They're being sued. So these are brave individuals and officials standing up for their own voters, for their own privacy of their voters. And meanwhile, they're getting sued. So that's one thing that is happening, and we certainly think will continue to happen with executive interference. Another would be, again, just these false narratives to create chaos, to undermine trust. And it's not just about 2020 or 2022. It's about laying the groundwork for justifying additional interference. False narratives justified the FBI raid. False narratives have justified what we just found out yesterday about Tulsi Gabbard and her office of the Director of National Intelligence seizing electronic tabulator counting machines in Puerto Rico back in May. We didn't know this until recently, until just the past few days. So they seized machines from Puerto Rico, which again breaks the whole, what we call chain of custody in
Right.
elections, where once it's taken away from that sort of election office, you don't know what's happening to that data, those equipment. Same thing with Fulton County. So there's a whole litany of executive interference actions that can be taken beyond just sort of like the deploying the troops, the big flashy things that are clearly illegal.
Yeah, I think the chain of custody thing is a thing that I really want to unpack here, because I'm in Detroit, and I was here in Detroit in 2020
Mhm.
when you had election workers who were sent to election observers, I should say, who were sent to what was then, I guess, the TCF Center. It's now something else. When they were counting ballots or banging on the walls, videotaping people who were just trying to tabulate votes. There was a perennial attorney general candidate here in the state of Michigan who was accused of stealing vote tabulators. And then the president called one of they're on the board of canvassers, so the people who certify the election and make it official for listeners. He called and tried to intimidate her. Her name was Monica Palmer. And all those things happened. But let's talk about the chain of custody, because so much of the false narratives and the people who believe them, including a video the president posted last night, just before midnight, involve people just not understanding how the chain of custody and like voting tabulators actually work. So how does the chain of custody actually work?
Yeah, the chain of custody, it's a pretty simple concept. And, this is not just something in the United States. This is really something that is a sacred element of elections all around the world. And I've worked in over 30 countries on elections. It's a crucial element. It's as crucial as like the secrecy of the ballot. Everyone
Mhm.
should be able to cast their ballot without having someone else know what they're voting for and being able to pressure them. This is like almost the same kind of concept with election administrators, where there are sensitive voting material like ballots, like the machines that process the ballots or count the ballots, and other sensitive material. The chain of custody means that from the lowest level, like let's say the polling station, all the way up to the highest level of, say, counting, maybe at the state level, there needs to be very clear security measures on who is possessing that equipment at the various times. Only authorized people at various parts in the process can have that material, can access that material. And each time somebody accesses it, there are like record logs, kept to determine. And so people can track back only these people specifically had access who were authorized at that moment to have it. As it's passed up the chain, or even if it's stored, if machines are stored in between elections, the chain of custody includes, no one should be accessing that while it's stored unless they're authorized to do so, and it's duly logged and monitored and overseen the way it should be. So that's basically it in a nutshell. What you have with the FBI coming in Fulton County is they just took the 700 ballot boxes and the tabulator tapes that show voting records. They took it, and they're not part of the chain of custody, and they weren't authorized to be part of the chain of custody. And the poor election officials in Fulton County say, we can't vouch for anything that happens now. Whatever
Right.
the FBI is doing with those ballots, no one knows what they're doing. No one can vouch for that. So that's the problem here: is we can't trust that. We can't trust what the FBI says about that information anymore because there's no chain of custody.
Right. And that is a hallmark of the, illiberal democracies, small L illiberal. When you think of these elections, places like Russia, where, you've got what look to be free elections, but then you have this interruption in the chain of custody, and we don't know what happens after those are getting counted. Is there a
Yeah.
version of this in which ballots, in an attempt to federalize the election, it is the federal government who then counts the ballots, and then we just get it takes forever then to count those things. It takes forever to get the count of the midterm elections. Let's say it's 2026, even though it's pretty close at this point to try to get states to ramp up to that. But is that even a thing that we could be looking at?
It's a great question. If you take what the president said earlier this week, you might
Mhm.
think that he might want that, or there might be a push for that. That is absolutely 0% chance of possibility according to the laws in the Constitution. So people should be reassured. Ballots, there are great election officials at the local level. They will be counted the way they should be counted, which is at the local level, and then passed on up to the state level. There are multiple security checks, verification checks all along the way. Um, and there will be no federal level counting. That's not in the law. That's not in the Constitution. It's not possible. And then lastly on that, I think it's something like 99.8% of ballots cast in the United States have a paper record,
Yeah.
a paper ballot or a paper record of a printout of that ballot. And that's really crucial because we hear these conspiracy theories about voting machines and counting machines being tampered with, and nothing's ever been proven on this. But even if there were tampering, the official record is the paper ballot, what we call the voter verified paper audit trail. It's a long term, but what it means is no matter whether you're voting on an electronic voting machine or a paper ballot, you're going to get a printout of your vote, and the voter can see, yes, it recorded who I voted for correctly. That is put somewhere, safely stored, and the audits after the election, if there's a challenge, are based on the paper record. So again, these conspiracy theories about messing with voting machines and other things like that, it all comes back to the paper ballot, where about 99.8% of votes cast have a paper record. So
Yeah, I think this is actually a good spot to move into the. I think what we're really talking about now is sort of this three-legged stool approach to federal interference in the upcoming election. So we've got the stuff we just talked about, the push or whatever you want to call it to federalize elections. And then you've got the set of bills working their way through Congress and the Senate right now, which are some version of the SAVE Act, the Save America Act, when they're talking about voter fraud and the need for real ID compliant or IDs that show your citizenship. And at this moment, we are talking about probably disenfranchising quite a few voters. I mean, potentially millions if we're looking at just people who don't have passports. Are you guys doing work on that stuff as well right now?
yes, good question. So first of all, the Congress actually does have the ability to pass laws related to federal elections. So constitutionally, legislation in Congress is where things should be done if you want to change the federal elections, at least, and have a say over how that's run. Now, we know that the SAVE Act, as you said, there's a Save America Act that just came out. There's also a Make Elections Great Again Act, the MEGA Act that just came out.
Right.
All of these, despite the fact that it's good, they're coming from Congress. They're basically carrying out exactly what Trump laid out in his executive order last March, most of which has been blocked because it's against the Constitution. So it is basically the Trump administration agenda just sort of rammed through, trying to ram it through with Republicans on the Hill. They have zero chance of passing. They can't get past the filibuster. That being said, we are working very heavily on them. We have very significant concerns. I think the main two concerns I would flag would be, number one, each of them has a documentary proof of citizenship requirement to register to vote. On the surface, of course, everyone who's only a citizen should be voting. The thing is, every state already has a process to do that. Every state already verifies and makes its voters sign, in a lot of cases, sign letters, and has very strict penalties for any voter who is a non-citizen and either registers or attempts to vote. Second, millions and millions of people don't have ready access to those proofs of citizenship, passports, birth certificates. How many people listening here have their original birth certificate easily accessible? Not that many. If a woman or a man changed their last name when they married, they might not have the proof of all of that to be able to determine, their own back to their proof of citizenship. So millions of voters could end up not being registered to vote because of this requirement, when they don't need to put it in because you already have all these processes in place in the state. Also, our other concern is if we're worried about election security, why don't we focus on the things that really are threats to election security? Non-citizen voting has been proven to not be a problem in this country. There is no evidence of widespread or even more than a few dozen non-citizens being registered in any individual state. And even then, if there were some that were registered, only a few voted, even very, very few are voted. So even like the Heritage Foundation's own tracker and database shows, I think it's a few dozen non-citizens that were found to be registered over the past period of time. So it's a non-issue.
Yeah, it's over the course of several decades, and we are talking hundreds of millions of vote cast, and the number for those is like it is like 40 or something.
It's like
It's
34, 40,
yeah,
somewhere in that range.
yeah,
It's a non-issue. So that's part of the problem is we all agree elections should be secure, free, and fair. The problem is that the Save America Save and Mega Act are focusing almost all this attention on the proof of citizenship, which is not a problem. Is
right.
not a problem at all. So that diverts attention away from things that are problems. The other thing that two of them do, not Save, but the other two, is a photo ID requirement
Mhm.
for registering for voting, for actually voting. Again, makes sense to a lot of people. I worked around the world. It's a very common thing. The challenge is that yes, if you want to require photo IDs, we need to make sure people have those IDs.
Right.
And again, millions of people don't have those IDs. And in some states, they make it such a strict requirement of the types of IDs you can use that disenfranchises another, hundreds of thousands of people. So there needs to be some give and take by both the Democrats and Republicans on that issue if we want to have common sense voter IDs. The other thing I would say about these pieces of legislation is the impact on our elections and our brave election officials that they have. Many of the provisions in these bills would impose these big unfunded mandates on election officials, requiring whole new systems of processing voters, registering voters, putting more strings attached to federal funding on elections that would potentially be used for partisan ends, and a whole slew of other things that we heard from election officials across the aisle, both sides of the aisle, that they're concerned of like the impact, the chaos that this could unleash, that they don't have funding to implement these things that are being imposed. So a lot of concerns about the bills. We're doing a lot to help hopefully push back on them, but also ultimately they are Republican only bills. There's zero chance that any Democrat would come on board. So very little chance of passing in certainly in the Senate.
Right. And I just this morning there was a change made to the Save America Act, if I saw this right, that they wanted it to be when you went to the polls, you had to have a photo ID that also proved your citizenship, and that would only be your passport and then an enhanced ID in certain border states, and generally just northern border states. So that would disenfranchise, I mean, tens of millions, if not maybe a little bit more than that, of voters who just don't have those IDs, who have actual state driver's licenses. So this is one of those things where it's not just onerous, like you said, for election workers, but also for voters. But you did lead me to the next thing here, because issue one just came out with this really amazing and dispiriting study, I suppose, a report about just this another round of a mass exodus of our election workers. So walk me through your findings there. But before we get to the findings, talk to me about who election workers are, because I think we don't think about them enough, and we really should think about them more.
Thank you for the question. This is a really important issue that I think, like you said, is not so. Election officials have been quietly doing their heroic jobs for decades and decades in the United States, and we actually call them the faces of democracy. We have a whole campaign and network of over 60 bipartisan election officials to really honor the work they do. So for decades and decades, they were toiling away quietly, just running safe and secure elections in the United States. When you have in 2020 false election narratives come up, and then ramped up and ramped up and ramped up since then, what has happened is they have become targets of intimidation, of harassment, of lawsuits, and their jobs have become, multiple times more difficult. There's much more scrutiny on their work, undeserved scrutiny on certain aspects, and again, these false narratives are just targeting people to go at them and intimidate them and harass them, and it's a shame because again they are working tirelessly throughout the years before and after elections to carry out our democracy, the core process of our democracy. So we view them as the heroes, and it is unfortunate that what has happened over the last several years. So turning to the impact of all those things I just mentioned, the interference and the harassment, intimidation. We did a report where we studied and we looked at the turnover, like how many election officials, particularly chief election officials in the Western states.
Mm-hmm.
What was how did that look? how many people left their jobs starting from the 2020 election, which was kind of the triggering moment where it got really difficult for them, up until the recent elections, in November. And what we found was quite alarming. It was 50% of the chief election officials in those 11 Western states left their jobs in that, say, 5-ish year period. And the thing is, it's not just because like they timed out, their term limits ended. Over 3/4 of them left for personal reasons, which, in a lot of cases, they're not willing to say exactly what the personal reasons are, but they left before their term ended. So you can imagine, and we know from talking anecdotally to many of them that they left because of the intimidation, the harassment, the pressure, that the job had just become intolerable.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, they were dealing with threats, like actual threats. So I think this really was a wake up call should be a wake up call for all of us to, for voters, for everyday people, to support their election officials, their local officials, their poll workers. People are volunteering. You can become a poll worker and see all the great work you can do. You can, write a letter to your local election board and say thank you for your work. But ultimately, like what risk this puts on our elections is quite significant, and we have to pay attention to it. We are looking at a situation where it's essentially a brain drain of these very experienced election officials who have many years running elections, and now being replaced by some people with experience, but some people who are learning quickly. And so we don't want to see that much turnover when we have midterms coming up in 2026. So those are some things we're concerned about. We do offer in the report some ideas for recommendations of how this could be fixed right before 2026. That starts at the top. That starts with the presidential administration, tamp down the rhetoric, stop promoting false narratives. Don't be raiding, FBI, using the FBI to raid offices and suing these poor election administrators because they won't give you data that you don't need anyway and you shouldn't have by law anyway. So tamp down the rhetoric, tamper down the false narratives. But then there are also things that, local election offices and state level election officials can do to, bring in that next pipeline of officials. In Arizona, they have a great fellowship program when they bring in kind of new election officials. There's a lot of innovation happening among the election officials to try to deal with this problem.
Mm-hmm.
But the unfortunate reality is it's not a problem of their making. It's a problem of, what's happening with the false narratives being cast at them.
Yeah, I was going to say, probably don't hold your breath for that top tier to do what you want. But most local clerks and a lot of state secretaries of state's offices or whoever administers the elections in your state, they will have a walkthrough of how these ballots get counted. I've been a journalist in those rooms. News stations will and should go attend those things. And it might feel a little boring when you're there. It's not the best, video in the world, but it does explain how these things work. I'm curious about the people who come in after all these experienced election workers. Are we seeing more out and out partisans? Because yes, you get inexperience, and that does lead to people who, may be more susceptible to these false narratives. But do you get people who try to get into these positions after forcing somebody out through intimidation who have their own agendas that, might align with the current administration?
Yeah, that's definitely a very serious concern. There isn't a very nationwide detailed analysis that I've seen of that yet, but anecdotally, it was definitely a big concern heading into 2022 and 2024. And we didn't see it play out as much as I think a lot of those watching closely were fearing, which is a good thing. What we saw was that, again, the brave election officials were, whether they are from, Democratic Party or the Republican Party, doing their jobs in a nonpartisan manner. And so for the most part, we saw that continue to hold even with this attrition, that new people are coming in who are doing the right things. There have been some cases of, election deniers, as they might be called, coming in and maybe trying to rabble rouse. But there's also these interesting stories of people who were election deniers who went to one of those transparency events that you mentioned or became a poll worker, and they said, you know what, I see how this process works. Like, actually, I can trust this process now. So that's actually a really not a common but a frequently mentioned story that's happened to a lot of people. And I hope that happens to more people. Now, on the election denier front, places we are concerned about where they are coming in is at the top, right? So we have the Department of Homeland Security, which is, has a responsibility for our cybersecurity of our elections. One of the top people there is Heather Honey. She is a very well-known and proud election denier from 2020, promotes false election narratives. Most election officials see the Department of Homeland Security now as more of a risk and a threat to them, as opposed to in past elections where the DHS was the provider of cybersecurity support, and everybody really valued the support they got from that department. And now it's sort of oh gosh, what are they going to come at us with kind of approach. And same in the Department of Justice, you have a number of election deniers, people who have spread false narratives in the past, and they're in top positions there as well, including the head of the Civil Rights Division, who is has a lot of power when it comes to elections. They're supposed to be enforcing civil rights, enforcing voter rights and protections, and instead we have an election denier who is bent on restricting voter rights and using false narratives to justify such restrictions.
How much harder does that make running elections for the folks you talk to?
Well, yeah, we talked about some of the issues. I mean, it's when you have the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, the president himself, essentially, like I said, using the false narratives to interfere with and to come at the local election officials with accusations, with raids. They are now a hostile force.
Yeah.
They're a hostile force. And it's sort of like, the fox in the hen house, where you have election deniers in these key positions doing the opposite of what they should be doing to help protect elections. So it is putting a lot of pressure on local officials, state level election officials. But the good news is I was just at the Secretaries of State conference last week, which was the head of they're the heads of elections in all the states. I can tell you they are very brave. They're very well prepared. They are going to stand up for their state's rights to run their own elections. And, they're in a good place to protect against this, but we all need to be, vigilant and also supporting their efforts.
I know that every few years there's this idea bandied about that some states will sort of come together as a collective to help support each other without the support of, let's say, CISA, right? Let's say DHS and cybersecurity. Are states starting to pool their resources more? Because this stuff, while logistically difficult, while it takes a lot of manpower and man hours, it's also expensive.
That is a huge challenge right now.
Yeah.
As you just mentioned, the Department of Homeland Security used to provide through CISA a whole range of cybersecurity supports, as well as they supported some like coordination bodies amongst the, both with the intelligence services of the United States government, with local election officials and state officials, and even with, say, private companies. And they could quickly share threats and vulnerabilities and quickly be able to respond and share best practices. Those are not being funded anymore by the federal government. So there is a lot of scrambling to try to figure out how that can be stood up and funded. I think I was just at that conference I mentioned last week, and there was a lot of discussion about some very promising efforts to kind of get some of that stood up and support election officials. Because you can imagine in rural areas, especially, very small election offices, they're not knowledgeable in a lot of cases about cybersecurity protections and things like that. And they used to be able to get that support from CISA, and they're not going to get that anymore. So huge gap, huge vulnerability. But the good side is that I know there are a lot of good efforts and good people trying to organize to fill those gaps, and make these elections secure. Because, luckily we have seen 2020, 2022, and 2024 were very, very secure elections. And we want to make sure we continue that for 2026.
This is my last one here, and it's sort of a bigger think thing. Some of the folks that I've talked to who work in election security, who have worked elections themselves for decades, are worried that 2026 is going to be sort of a Humpty Dumpty election in which we break it and can't put it back together again. Is that a fear you share, or are you more optimistic about election workers and the health of our actual election administration?
So I put this into perspective for myself because I worked in so many different countries, and many of them are far more authoritarian than we are right now in the United States, and their elections were already broken. They were already almost sham elections in a lot of cases. So what gives me optimism is that I know that we're not going to get to that place. What scares me is that there are going to be attempts to get us to that place of having, an election that is the playing field is so tilted that power can be entrenched for one side. And I know that's what's being attempted right now. And we should really be very cognizant that there is an attempt by the administration to use the powers and abuse the powers of the federal government to control and tilt the playing field of our elections. So that is a very real threat. What gives me hope is I know how much worse it can get, and I know that we have very unique capabilities here in the United States. Like I said, the decentralized election infrastructure, the brave election officials, the very robust civil society that we have, organizations like Issue One, but many other organizations across the country who are vigilant, and they're ready, and they're trying to make sure voters are seeing these threats, and hoping they can mobilize to tell their politicians that we don't want to see takeover of our elections. We don't want to see this interference. So that's what gives me hope is knowing that we have some really unique capabilities here in the United States that can protect us against it. But it takes all of us. We all have to be engaged. It doesn't just happen on its own and automatically. We all have to be engaged in vigilantly protecting elections.
Michael, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Grant. This was great. Appreciate it.
I want to thank Michael again for coming on the show. You can find a link to Issue 1 and a separate link to that brand new report about election workers that we talked about in the show notes. And that's it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack. And as always, share the show on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. You can find me at Grant Herms on Twitter and Blue Sky, and at Grant_Herms on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you next week.